Some things don't knock before they enter your life. They wait quietly, until you're the one who finally notices. The road into Blackridge County stretched for miles without a single streetlight, just a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through endless pine and shadow, and Daniel Mercer drove it in silence, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting absently on the thick fur of the German shepherd beside him. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, ears alert, eyes catching every flicker of movement beyond the windshield, as if the darkness itself had something to say, and only he knew how to listen. The old pickup rattled softly at 40 miles per hour, its engine humming low like a tired heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance, wind slipped through the trees with a sound that almost resembled breathing. Daniel hadn't planned to come this far north, not really, but plans had stopped meaning much after the accident, after the silence that followed, after the kind of loss that didn't scream but settled deep into your bones and stayed there. He had found the listing by accident, a small one. Bedroom cabin, off-grid, cheap enough to not ask questions, sitting on 5 acres of land that looked forgotten even on the map. It wasn't a fresh start. He knew better than to believe in those. It was just distance. Sometimes distance was enough. The tires crunched over gravel as the cabin finally came into view, sitting low beneath a canopy of towering pines, its wood weathered to a dull gray. The porch sagging slightly on one side like it had grown tired of waiting. Daniel killed the engine and let the quiet settle in. Real quiet. The kind that presses gently against your ears until you realize how loud the rest of the world used to be. Shadow didn't move at first, his body still, gaze locked on the cabin as if something inside had already caught his attention. Easy, Daniel murmured, his voice low, more habit than reassurance. He stepped out into the cold evening air, the temperature hovering somewhere in the low 40s, his breath visible in soft clouds that drifted and disappeared just as quickly as they formed. The scent of pine and damp earth lingered in the stillness, grounding and unfamiliar at the same time. He grabbed his duffel from the back and headed toward the front door, boots creaking softly against the worn wooden steps. Shadow followed close behind, but slower now, more cautious, his nails clicking once, then stopping. Daniel noticed it then, just a slight hesitation, nothing dramatic, but enough. Inside, the cabin was dim, the last of the daylight slipping through narrow windows, painting long, pale lines across the wooden floor. Dust hung in the air like it had nowhere else to go. The space was simple, a small living area, a narrow hallway, a kitchen that hadn't seen much use in years, and there, against the far wall, was the mirror, tall, old, framed in dark wood, its surface slightly clouded as though it remembered things it refused to show clearly. Daniel set his bag down and stepped further inside. The floor creaked beneath his weight, a slow, steady sound that echoed just enough to feel noticed. Shadow stopped near the doorway, his body rigid now, eyes fixed not on Daniel, not on the room, but directly at the mirror, his ears tilted forward, tail low but not tucked, just uncertain. Daniel followed his gaze. The mirror reflected the room behind him, the door, the fading light, his own silhouette standing still in the center. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Just an old house, he muttered. Though the words didn't settle as easily as he expected, Shadow took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, until he stood a few feet from the mirror, his reflection staring back at him, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, and then, without warning, the dog let out a low, uneasy breath, not quite a growl, not quite fear, something in between, something older. Daniel felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air, like the room had exhaled without him noticing. The temperature dipped just enough to make the back of his neck tighten. He glanced around. Nothing moved, nothing changed, and yet something felt different. Shadow didn't bark. Not yet. He simply stood there, watching, waiting, as if the mirror wasn't showing him what it was supposed to, as if something behind the reflection hadn't decided whether to stay hidden or step forward. And for the first time since he arrived, Daniel hesitated to move any closer. Because some instincts don't come from fear, they come from knowing that once you look at something the wrong way, it might start looking back. Daniel did not move for a long moment. Not because he was afraid, but because something inside him recognized that the silence in that room was no longer empty. It had weight now, a presence that did not announce itself but settled quietly into the corners like it had always belonged there. Shadow's body remained still, every muscle held in a quiet tension that Daniel had learned to trust more than any warning sign. The dog was not reacting out of confusion. He was observing, listening to something that had not yet made a sound. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked softly, though his voice felt heavier than it should have. Like the air resisted it just slightly, Shadow did not turn, did not blink. His eyes stayed locked on the mirror, as if whatever held his attention was not on the surface, but somewhere beyond it. Daniel took a slow step forward. The floor creaked beneath his boot, the sound sharper now in the stillness. He stopped just short of the mirror, close enough to see the faint imperfections in the glass, tiny distortions that bent the reflection just enough to make the room behind him feel off. He lifted his hand and hovered it near the surface, not touching it, just feeling the air near. The glass was cooler, not cold enough to see his breath, but enough to notice, enough to feel like the temperature had quietly shifted in that one small space. Shadow let out a low exhale again, softer this time, almost like a warning that did not want to be heard too loudly. Daniel finally pressed his fingertips against the glass. It was colder than the rest of the room, unnaturally so, like it had not felt warmth in a very long time. And for a brief second, something moved, not in the room, not behind him, but within the reflection itself, a flicker so subtle it could have been his own breath catching. He pulled his hand back immediately, not in panic, but in recognition. There had been something there, something that did not match the movement he had just made. Shadow shifted his weight, stepping slightly to the side, adjusting his angle, and that was when Daniel noticed it. From where the dog stood, the reflection changed, just slightly, just enough that the space behind Daniel's figure looked deeper than the room actually was, like the wall behind him had stepped back an extra inch that did not exist in reality. Daniel frowned, his mind trying to settle on a logical explanation. Warped glass, old materials, light distortion, but none of it sat right. Not with the way Shadow was watching, not with the way the air felt. He moved slowly to the left, testing it, watching the reflection carefully, and there it was again, that slight delay, that faint misalignment, as though the mirror was not keeping up with him, as though it was deciding what to show instead of simply reflecting what was there. Shadow let out a single, quiet bark, not loud, not sharp, just one, but it landed in the room with a weight that made Daniel stop completely. The kind of sound that meant the dog had confirmed something, not questioned it. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry, and looked again, really looked this time, not at himself, but past himself, into the space behind his reflection. The room appeared the same, the door, the fading light, the long shadows stretching across the floor, and yet there was a sense, faint but undeniable, that something was not aligned, that the version of the room in the mirror was not entirely the same as the one he stood in. Shadow took another step back, lowering his body slightly, not in fear, but in readiness, as if waiting for something to reveal itself when the moment was right. Daniel slowly turned his head, just enough to glance over his shoulder at the real room behind him. Everything was still, unchanged, exactly as it should be. He turned back to the mirror, and for a fraction of a second, just before his eyes settled, the reflection showed something else, something that had not been there before, a shape, faint, undefined, standing just at the edge of where the light could reach. Gone the moment he tried to focus on it. Daniel froze, not because he had seen clearly, but because he had not, because whatever it was did not want to be seen directly, only noticed in passing, only acknowledged when you were not looking straight at it. And beside him, Shadow let out a second, softer bark, the kind that did not ask for attention, but confirmed that whatever Daniel had almost seen was real enough for the dog to recognize it too. Daniel did not step away from the mirror this time, not because the unease had faded, but because something deeper had taken hold, a quiet pull that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, as if some part of him had already accepted that whatever lived within that reflection was not entirely separate from him. Shadow shifted again, pacing slowly in a small arc behind Daniel, his nails clicking softly against the wood, each step measured, controlled, the way he moved when he was mapping something unseen, tracking not a scent, but a presence. Daniel watched the mirror carefully, not directly at his own reflection, but slightly off, letting his eyes drift just enough to catch what might appear when he was not trying to force it. The room behind him in the glass felt wrong now in a way he could not ignore. The angles were just slightly deeper, the shadows stretching farther than they should, like the reflection was holding on to light differently, as if it belonged to another version of the same space. He slowly took a step backward, testing the distance, and the reflection followed, but again, not perfectly. There was a delay, a fraction of a second that lingered just long enough to feel intentional. Shadow stopped pacing and sat down, but his posture was rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed, his breathing slow and controlled. Daniel had seen this before, not here, not in a place like this, but years ago, in situations where Shadow had detected something buried, something hidden beneath layers that the human eye could not perceive. This was not confusion. This was confirmation. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and shifted his position again, this time stepping to the right, watching closely, and that was when the difference became undeniable. In the reflection, the wall behind him was no longer flat. It seemed to dip inward, like a shallow recess that did not exist in the real room. He turned his head quickly to check the actual wall. It was solid, unchanged, plain wood paneling with no sign of an opening. He turned back to the mirror, and there it was again, that subtle depth, that impossible space that only existed within the glass. Shadow let out a third bark, sharper this time, not loud, but firm, a signal Daniel had learned long ago meant discovery. Not danger, something had been found. Daniel stepped closer to the mirror again, his pulse steady but heavier now, and raised his hand, not to touch the glass, but to trace the air where the reflection suggested that hidden depth. His fingers hovered, then pressed lightly against the wall beside the mirror, the real wall, the solid one. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it. Not a movement, not a sound, but a difference in the surface. One section of the wood was cooler, smoother, almost as if it had been replaced or sealed over. He narrowed his eyes, focusing, his hand moving slowly along the panel, following the faint line where the texture shifted, and then he saw it, barely visible, a seam, thin as a thread, running vertically about 3 feet behind where he stood. His breath caught, not in fear, but in realization. The mirror was not showing something supernatural, not entirely. It was revealing something hidden, something physically there, but carefully concealed. Shadow stood immediately, stepping toward that exact spot, placing his nose against the wall and inhaling slowly, deliberately. Then he tapped it once with his paw, a soft, controlled motion, as if to say, "This is where you look." Daniel stepped back from the mirror, turning fully now to face the wall, the real wall, his hand still resting on the faint seam. The air around that section felt different, still, like it had not been disturbed in a long time. He pressed gently, nothing, then a little, harder, and the panel shifted just slightly, enough to confirm it was not fixed in place. He hesitated for only a second, the kind of hesitation that comes when you know the next action cannot be undone. Then he pushed, slowly, carefully, and the panel gave way with a soft, almost reluctant creak, opening inward just a few inches, a narrow gap revealing darkness beyond, not empty darkness, but the kind that holds shape, that waits quietly for light to define it. Shadow stepped back, not retreating, but giving space, his eyes still locked on the opening, his body alert, but no longer tense. As if whatever had been hidden there was not a threat, but something that had been waiting. Daniel reached for the flashlight in his bag without taking his eyes off the gap, his fingers closing around it as the weight of the moment settled fully into place. The mirror behind him now silent, still, reflecting only what was in front of it, as if its purpose had already been fulfilled. And as Daniel raised the light toward the narrow opening, he understood something with a quiet certainty. The reflection had not been showing him what was behind him in the room. It had been showing him what had been hidden from him all along. Daniel held the flashlight steady for a moment before turning it on, as if giving whatever waited beyond that narrow opening one last chance to remain unseen. But the silence did not change, the air did not shift, and so he pressed the switch, a soft click breaking the stillness as a narrow beam of light cut into the darkness behind the wall. The space beyond was smaller than he expected, not a room, not quite a hallway, more like a hidden recess carved into the structure itself, just wide enough for a person to step through, the wooden edges rough and unfinished, as if it had been built quickly or quietly. Shadow stepped closer, not rushing, not hesitant, simply moving with the same calm awareness that had guided him to this point. His head lowered slightly as he peered into the gap, ears still forward, listening to something deeper than the silence. Daniel pushed the panel a little wider, the hinges giving a soft, tired creak and a faint smell. Drifted out, old wood, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic and dry, like air that had not moved in years. He stepped inside slowly, one foot crossing the threshold, then the other, the floor beneath him solid but slightly uneven. The beam of the flashlight revealing narrow walls on either side, no more than 4 feet apart, with the ceiling just above his head, low enough that he instinctively ducked. Shadow remained just behind him, not entering fully, but not leaving either, positioned at the opening as if guarding the space between what was known and what was not. Daniel moved the light forward, the beam stretching into the narrow passage, and at the end, about 6 feet in, the space opened slightly into a small chamber, barely larger than a closet, the walls lined with the same aged wood, but darker here, as if they had absorbed years of stillness. In the center of that space sat a simple wooden chair, its surface worn smooth, positioned deliberately to face the wall opposite it. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet weight of intention. This had not been random. This space had been used, the chair had been placed, and for a long time. Someone had sat there, looking at something. He stepped closer, the beam of light shifting to the wall in front of the chair, and there it was, another mirror, smaller than the one in the main room, but identical in its frame, dark wood, aged, its surface just as faintly clouded. It hung at eye level, perfectly aligned with where someone would sit. Daniel exhaled slowly, the realization settling in layers. The mirror in the main room had not been placed for decoration. It had been positioned, aligned with this one, creating a line of sight that passed through the wall itself. He turned slightly, angling the flashlight back toward the opening, and from this position, he could see it, faintly, the reflection of the larger mirror beyond, both surfaces facing each other through the narrow gap, creating a corridor of reflections that stretched deeper than the physical space allowed. Shadow let out a quiet sound behind him, not a bark, not a growl, something softer, almost like recognition. Daniel turned back to the smaller mirror, his light resting on its surface, and for a moment, it reflected only the beam, a dull glow in the glass. But then, as he shifted slightly, the angle changed, and the reflection deepened, layers appearing where there should have been none, the image extending beyond the wall, beyond the cabin, into something that did not match the space around him. His breath slowed, his focus narrowing as he leaned just a little closer, careful, deliberate, and that was when he noticed it. Not a figure, not yet, but a distortion, a faint shape that did not align with his movement, positioned just behind where he stood, as if something existed within the reflection that had no place in the room itself. He did not turn this time. He did not break the line of sight, because something told him that whatever revealed itself here did not follow the rules of the physical world. It followed attention, it followed awareness, and beside him, just outside the narrow chamber, Shadow lowered himself slowly to the floor, his body finally relaxing, not because the unknown had disappeared, but because it had been found, and sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Daniel did not blink as he stared into the smaller mirror, his mind no longer trying to explain what he saw, but instead adjusting to it. The way a person learns to hear a faint sound only after they stop trying to silence it. The reflection was no longer just a reflection, it had depth now, layers that did not belong to wood or glass. And somewhere within those layers, that faint shape remained, just at the edge of perception, never fully forming, never fully gone. He shifted slightly in place, testing it, and the shape responded, not by moving in a way he could track, but by becoming just a little more defined. As if his attention gave it permission to exist, a subtle outline began to emerge behind his reflected figure, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel, like someone standing a few feet back in a room that was not quite the same as the one he occupied. His breathing slowed further, steady and controlled, the kind of breathing that had carried him through moments when clarity mattered more than comfort. He did not turn around, not this time, because he understood something now. Whatever existed within that reflection did not follow the same rules as everything else. It was not bound to the physical space behind him. It was tied to the angle, the alignment, the connection between the two mirrors. Shadow shifted again at the entrance, lifting his head slightly, but not rising. His eyes calm now, watching Daniel instead of the mirrors, as if the responsibility had passed, as if the discovery was no longer his to guide. Daniel leaned forward just a fraction, bringing his face closer to the glass. The beam of the flashlight steady in his hand, illuminating only what it chose to reveal. And as the angle narrowed, the shape became clearer, not detailed, not fully visible, but unmistakably human in form, standing still, positioned directly behind him in the reflection. And yet Daniel could feel the empty space at his back, the real room unchanged, untouched. The separation between what was real and what was seen had never felt thinner. His throat tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that does not come from logic, but from memory. Something about the presence felt familiar, not in identity, but in feeling, in the quiet weight it carried, like a memory that had never fully left. He closed his eyes for a brief second, just enough to steady himself, then opened them again, and this time, he spoke, his voice low, calm, almost respectful. "I know you are there." The words did not echo, they did not disturb the air, but something shifted in the reflection. The shape did not move, but it became more certain, more anchored, as if being acknowledged had given it form. Daniel swallowed slowly, his gaze unwavering, and for a moment, everything else fell away, the cabin, the walls, the cold air, leaving only the narrow beam of light, the mirror, and the presence behind him that existed without needing to step forward. Shadow exhaled softly, a long, quiet breath, and rested his head on his paws. His body fully relaxed now, no tension, no alertness, only stillness, as if whatever had been waiting to be found had finally been seen. Daniel remained where he was, neither stepping closer nor pulling away, understanding that this moment was not about action, but about awareness. And as the seconds passed, the shape in the reflection did not disappear, did not retreat. It simply remained, steady and silent, like something that had never intended to harm, only to be noticed. And in that quiet, suspended space between what was seen and what was real, Daniel realized something with a clarity that settled deep within him. Not everything hidden is meant to stay buried, and not everything unseen is meant to be feared. Some things wait patiently, not for the right moment, but for the right person to finally look at them. Without turning away, Daniel did not move away from the mirror, but something within him shifted, subtle and steady, like a door opening not outward, but inward, the kind of change that does not make a sound yet alters everything that follows. The presence in the reflection remained where it was, no closer, no farther, but no longer uncertain. Its outline now held a quiet clarity, not sharp, not detailed, but undeniably there. And the longer Daniel allowed himself to look without resisting, the more the feeling beneath it began to surface, not fear, not danger, but something deeper, something familiar in a way that bypassed logic and settled directly into memory. He lowered the flashlight slightly, letting the beam fall just below the mirror, allowing the reflection to soften. And in that softened light, the figure became less like an intrusion and more like a memory trying to return. His breath slowed again, deeper this time, and for a moment, the cabin seemed to fade at the edges, replaced by something less visible but more present, a quiet emotional weight that had followed him long before he ever arrived at this place. Shadow remained at the entrance, still and calm, his eyes half closed now, no longer tracking the mirror, no longer scanning the room, but resting, as if his role had ended the moment Daniel chose not to look away. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his position so that the alignment between the two mirrors remained intact, and as he did, the reflection responded again, not by moving forward, but by becoming clearer in its stillness. The outline sharpened just enough for him to recognize a shape within the shape, a posture, a presence that did not feel foreign, but known, deeply known. His throat tightened, not with fear, but with the quiet realization that whatever stood behind him in that reflection was not something that had followed him into this cabin. It was something that had been with him long before, something that had waited patiently, not in the physical world, but in the spaces he had avoided looking at. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the feelings settle fully, and when he opened them again, he did not search the reflection for answers. He simply allowed it to be there. And that was when the change happened, subtle but unmistakable. The figure in the mirror shifted, not forward, not backward, but closer in a way that did not follow distance, as if the space between them had less to do with feet and inches and more to do with awareness itself. Daniel felt it then, not as a touch, but as a presence at his back, the kind that does not disturb the air but alters the space around it. He did not turn, not this time, because he no longer needed to confirm it physically. The reflection was enough. The knowing was enough. Shadow let out a soft breath, almost like a quiet release, and rested his head fully on the floor, his body completely at ease now. Daniel's hand lowered further, the flashlight beam now resting on the wooden floor between him and the chair, leaving the mirror in a dim, natural shadow. And in that dimness, the reflection changed once more, the figure no longer standing apart, but aligned, its position now closer to his own, not overlapping, but no longer distant. And with that alignment came a feeling that was both heavy and calm, like a memory that had finally found its place. Daniel's voice came again, quieter this time, not questioning, not demanding, but acknowledging. You stayed. And though there was no sound in response, no movement that could be measured, something within the reflection softened, the shape becoming less defined, not fading, but settling, as if it no longer needed to hold itself together so tightly, as if being seen without resistance had allowed it to rest. Daniel stood there for a long moment, not trying to understand, not trying to explain, simply allowing the presence to exist without pushing it away. And in that stillness, he realized something that had nothing to do with the cabin, the mirrors, or the hidden space behind the wall. Some things do not follow you to haunt you. They follow you because they have nowhere else to go until you are ready to face them. And sometimes, the only way they can be seen is through the reflection you have been avoiding all along. Daniel remained where he stood, but the need to stay perfectly still had faded, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, like a weight he had carried for years had finally shifted just enough for him to breathe around it. The mirror no longer felt like a barrier between two worlds, but a surface where something long unspoken had finally found a way to be seen. The figure within it did not advance, did not retreat. It simply existed with him now, no longer separate, no longer reaching. And that changed everything. He slowly straightened. His posture, not breaking the alignment, but no longer leaning into it either, allowing the moment to settle naturally rather than forcing it to hold. The beam of the flashlight rested low, casting a soft glow across the floor and the legs of the chair, leaving the mirror dim, almost gentle, and in that softened light, the presence behind his reflection seemed less like a shape and more like a feeling given form, something that had never needed a face to be understood. Shadow shifted slightly at the entrance, lifting his head just enough to look toward Daniel, his eyes calm, steady, as if checking not for danger, but for change. And there was change, not in the room, not in the structure of the space, but in Daniel himself. The tension that had followed him into the cabin, the quiet resistance he had carried without naming it, had loosened, just enough to let something else in. He took a slow breath, deeper than before, and this time it did not catch in his chest. It moved freely, like the air had made room for it. He glanced once more into the mirror, not searching, not testing, just observing, and the reflection answered in kind, steady, unchanged, the presence still there, but no longer pressing at the edges of his awareness. It had settled, as if it no longer needed to prove anything, as if being acknowledged had been the only thing it required. Daniel lowered his hand completely, letting the flashlight hang loosely at his side, and for the first time since he had entered the hidden space, he allowed himself to turn, slowly, deliberately, away from the mirror. The movement felt significant, not because it broke the connection, but because it did not. He no longer needed to keep his eyes on the reflection to know it was there. That understanding remained with him, steady and quiet, as he stepped back toward the narrow opening, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his boots. Shadow rose as Daniel approached, his tail low but relaxed, his posture open, and when Daniel reached him, the dog leaned slightly into his leg, not seeking reassurance, but offering it. a silent confirmation that whatever had just passed between the seen and the unseen had reached its end. Daniel rested his hand on Shadow's neck for a moment, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur, grounding himself in something solid, something real. And yet, even that definition of real felt different now, wider somehow. He glanced once more over his shoulder, back into the small chamber, the chair still facing the mirror still reflecting the narrow space and the faint suggestion of something more. But nothing moved, nothing called for him to return. The moment had already unfolded exactly as it needed to. He stepped out of the hidden space, pulling the panel gently back into place, the wood settling with a soft, final sound that blended into the quiet of the cabin, as if the wall had never been opened at all. The main room felt different now, not changed in appearance, but in presence. The larger mirror on the wall stood where it had before, reflecting the dim interior, the door, the fading light outside, and when Daniel glanced at it, he saw only himself and Shadow standing beside him. Nothing more, and yet, the absence did not feel like loss. It felt like completion. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and moved further into the room, the weight in his chest lighter now, not gone, but no longer pressing in the same way, as if something that had been held in place for too long had finally been allowed to rest. Shadow followed him without hesitation, no longer drawn back to the mirror, no longer listening for something beyond it, just walking at Daniel's side with the quiet loyalty that had never once faltered. And as the last light of the day slipped fully behind the trees outside, leaving the cabin in a calm, steady darkness, Daniel understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. Not every presence comes to disturb, some come to be seen. And once they are, they no longer need to stay where they were hidden. The night settled around the cabin with a quiet that felt deeper than before, not empty, but full in a way Daniel could not quite explain, like the space itself had shifted from holding something unresolved to holding something understood. He moved through the small room slowly, setting his bag down near the old couch, the wood beneath his boots creaking in familiar patterns that no longer felt uncertain. Shadow followed close, his movements relaxed, his tail low and steady, no longer pausing to listen to the walls or glance toward the mirror. Whatever tension had guided him earlier had dissolved into a calm presence that matched Daniel's own. The larger mirror stood against the wall as it always had, its surface dim in the fading light, reflecting only the simple interior of the cabin. The door, the narrow windows, and the two figures now at ease within it. Daniel glanced at it briefly, not searching, not testing, just acknowledging. And in that glance, there was no distortion, no delay, no hidden depth waiting to be discovered. It was simply a mirror again, and somehow that felt more meaningful than anything he had seen before. He reached for the small lamp on the side table and turned it on, the soft yellow glow filling the room with warmth, pushing back the shadows without erasing them entirely, the kind of light that did not chase away the dark, but learned to exist beside it. Shadow circled once near the couch before settling down, his body curling into itself with a quiet sigh, his eyes half closing, the steady rhythm of his breathing returning to something natural, something unburdened. Daniel stood there for a moment, listening, not for anything beyond the walls, but for the simple sounds of the cabin, the faint whisper of wind outside, the soft creak of settling wood, the distant rustle of branches brushing against each other, all of it ordinary, all of it grounding. He walked to the small kitchen area and filled a glass with water, the faucet sputtering slightly. Before running clear, the sound sharp in the stillness but not unsettling, just present. He took a slow sip, the coolness steadying him, reminding him of where he stood, of what was real. And yet, the definition of real had expanded in a way that did not need to be explained. He leaned lightly against the counter, his gaze drifting back toward the mirror across the room, not out of concern, but out of quiet reflection. The man staring back at him looked the same as he had earlier that evening. Same posture, same tired lines in his face, same weight carried in his eyes. But something beneath that had shifted, something subtle, like a door that had finally been opened after being held shut for too long. Not everything that changes leaves a visible mark. Some changes live in the way a person breathes, in the way they stand, in the way they allow silence to exist without trying to fill it. Shadow stirred slightly, lifting his head for a brief moment before settling again, his gaze meeting Daniel's across the room, calm, certain, as if confirming that whatever had needed to be faced had been faced, and there was nothing left to guard against. Daniel pushed himself away from the counter and walked back toward the living area, lowering himself slowly onto the couch, the worn fabric giving slightly under his weight, the simple comfort of it grounding him further. He rested his elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, and let his eyes close for just a moment, not in exhaustion, but in acceptance, the kind that does not come from forgetting, but from understanding. And in that quiet, with the soft light casting gentle shadows across the walls, the cabin no longer felt like a place he had come to escape something. It felt like a place where something had finally caught up to him and been seen for what it was, not a threat, not a haunting, but a part of his own story that had waited patiently for its moment. And as the hours moved forward without disturbance, without sound beyond the natural rhythm of the night, Daniel remained where he was, not needing to check the mirror again, not needing to reopen the hidden space, because the reflection he had avoided was no longer behind him. It had been acknowledged, and in being acknowledged, it no longer needed to hide. Morning arrived slowly, not with a sudden burst of light, but with a gradual softening of the darkness that had settled over the cabin, the kind of dawn that does not rush, but unfolds in quiet layers, pale gray shifting into muted gold as the first light filtered through the tall pines outside. Daniel stirred on the couch, not waking from a deep sleep, but rising from a kind of rest he had not felt in a long time, the kind that does not erase what weighs on you, but loosens its hold just enough to let you breathe differently. Shadow was already awake, lying near the edge of the room where the faint light reached the floor, his head lifted, ears relaxed, watching the slow movement of morning without urgency, without tension. Daniel sat up, rubbing a hand over his face, his movement steady, unhurried, as if there was no longer a need to anticipate what might come next. The cabin felt unchanged in its structure, the same worn wood, the same quiet air, the same simple layout, and yet something within it had settled, as though the space itself had exhaled during the night and found a new stillness. He stood and stretched lightly, his joints responding with the familiar stiffness of a man who had carried more than just physical weight for too long. But even that felt different now, not lighter exactly, but no longer pressing in the same way. He walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let more light in. The forest beyond stood calm and steady, branches unmoving in the early morning stillness, a thin layer of frost catching the light along the ground, everything quiet, everything grounded. He glanced toward the mirror across the room, not out of concern, not out of curiosity, but simply because it was there, part of the space, part of the morning, and in its surface he saw only what belonged. Himself standing near the window, the outline of the trees behind him, the faint glow of daylight filling the cabin, nothing more, nothing hidden, and yet, that absence did not feel empty. It felt complete. Shadow rose and walked over to him, his steps soft, his presence steady, pressing lightly against Daniel's leg in a simple, familiar gesture. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers moving slowly through the thick fur, grounding himself in something constant, something that had never needed explanation. They stood like that for a moment, man and dog, facing the quiet morning, both aware in their own way that something had shifted, not outside, not in the world beyond the cabin, but within the space they carried inside themselves. Daniel stepped away from the window and moved toward the door, opening it slowly, the hinges giving a soft creak as the cold morning air drifted in, fresh and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool beneath his boots, the world stretching out before him in quiet simplicity, no movement, no disturbance, just the steady presence of a new day beginning without expectation. Shadow followed and sat beside him, his gaze moving across the tree line, calm, observant, but no longer searching for something unseen. Daniel took a slow breath, filling his lungs fully, and for the first time in a long while, the breath did not feel heavy on the way out. It moved freely, naturally, like something had been cleared from its path. He did not need to return to the hidden space, did not need to test the mirrors again, because whatever had been waiting there had already given him what it came to give. Not answers, not explanations, but a moment of clarity that did not require words. He rested his hands lightly on the porch railing, looking out at the quiet forest, and in that stillness, he understood something that would stay with him long after this place was left behind. Some things are not meant to follow you forever. They wait until you are ready to face them. And once you do, they do not disappear. They simply become part of you in a way that no longer needs to be hidden. And as the light grew stronger and the shadows of the night faded completely into the day, Daniel remained there, not searching for what had been, not fearing what might come, but standing fully in the present, with nothing behind him that needed to stay unseen anymore.